Jessica Kinsey, and I'm the Executive Director of Southern Utah Museum of Art. And I want to welcome you to tonight's lecture by Randall Cabe. But first, I'd like to thank the many sponsors that made our summer exhibitions possible. Iron County, Utah Division of Arts and Museums, American Macular Degeneration Foundation, Center for Figurative Painting, Bank of New York Mellon Corporation, Modern West Fine Art, Richard Spurzum, and Eric Brecker. So born in Los Angeles, Randall Cabe studied at the University of California, Davis, under the mentorship of Wayne Thiebaud for a Bachelor's of Art, and studied with Lennart Anderson at Brooklyn College for an MFA. He also participated in the program at the International School of Art in Todi, Italy, as well as a residency at Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture in Maine. His past teaching experiences include Southern Utah University, Laguna College of Art and Design, Art Center College of Design, Cal State University in Los Angeles, and Pasadena City College. Although he will get into a lot more details about his relationship with Lennart Anderson, it's important for me to emphasize that we would not be hosting the work of such a distinguished artist if it weren't for Randall. It was in 2021 that he first introduced me to Jeanette Anderson Wallace, who's here tonight, the daughter of Lennart and Barbara. Randall knew she was planning a new publication and a traveling exhibition for Lennart's work, which actually opened at the New York Studio School and was first curated by Rachel, who's also here tonight. Thank you. At that time, in 2021, Randall thought this would be a really incredible opportunity, not just for the museum, but for the university and his students. Unfortunately, since then, his teaching career has ended before he could share this with his students. So instead, you will have to indulge him tonight. So please join me in welcoming Randall.
Okay, well, I'd like to, she gave it all away, so I had all the thanks and the stuff. So, I made it so conversational. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome all of you and thank you for coming tonight. I'd also like to thank Lennart's daughter, Jeanette, for this opportunity. The Lee Morris Gallery, Lee Morris herself, and the team at SUMA, especially Becky Bloom, Mallory Sanders, and Scum Helbel. And of course, Jessica Kinsey, whose support is immeasurable, and I don't know how she put up with me doing this. All right. I suppose before I begin, I should give some background about myself, which might be helpful in understanding my approach to thinking about Lennart Anderson. In the mid-1980s, I began taking art classes at community college in the Los Angeles area. I had some good teachers, but for the most part, junior college art classes were no different than high school art class. Wildly disconnected assignments whose critical criteria was showing up and having fun. There didn't seem to be a focus on doing one thing well. At the time, I didn't have a lot of context to discern what a quality art education was, and for this, I blame the 1960s hold. Go back. The reason why I'm showing this slide is it's a 19th century representation of how kids actually drew and made art. And they took it very seriously. Look at them, they're probably 12 years old. It's incredible. So now we can go on. So yeah, sorry, I grew up a hippie. So I do blame the 60s. The countercultural revolution created so much hooey. I blame their intellectual off-gassing for global warming. For example, one myth they initiated and perpetuated for a good 40 years was this: everyone's an artist, man. We just have to break the chains of conformity, man. Well, by the mid-1980s, America had been perpetuating this mumbo-jumbo for over 20 years, to the point where everyone, even bankers, unironically called themselves artists. Imagine if everyone who ever owned a chemistry set as a kid still proclaimed that they're a scientist, or a first-year medical student claiming that they're already a doctor. It boggles the mind. So why do we do this with the arts? Well, because we've ruined art education, for the most part, turning it into an arts and crafts hour where everyone can indulge their hippie fantasies. But those dreams soon become a nightmare after a few bad paintings and $1,000 worth of wasted materials. That is unless something more, if there's something more than their self-proclaimed genius, something that is crucial for an artist to perpetuate their craft. Some tools, some driving questions, some historical context, and critical discernment. That's why I bring all this up, because by the age of 24, I too was still under the spell of this 1960s elective mythology, wasting art supplies and more confused than ever. That is until I was accepted to UC Davis and began studying with Wayne Thiebaud. Artist, scholar, reluctant intellectual. He took the history and practice of painting as serious as a brain surgeon at the operating table. He was the first to enlighten me as to what a quality education was, and not just about art. What he did was challenge students' preconceptions of their field of study, and by providing that historical context and critical language about painting, so that students upon leaving school will continue to build on a solid foundation and develop for themselves an informed practice. It's not easy. But Wayne, who saw that I was a fairly serious student and could draw fairly well and was interested in getting my shading all good, so after 2 years, he pulled me aside and told me about a summer program in Italy where he would be teaching. He mentioned the names of the other teachers who would be in residence, saying, "If you can go, you might like studying with Lennart Anderson." I had no idea who that was. So he pulled out a coffee table book called The Art of the Real, in which he and Lennart were featured. He thumbed through the pages, shaking his head in awe. "Oh, he's a wonderful painter." This is how he did it. "Look at that Jiffy Pop. Can you imagine trying to paint all those facets? You'd go mad." So I went to Italy in the summer of '90, and this is how I met Lennart Anderson. On the narrow sloping streets of the medieval town of Monte Castello di Vibbio. He was with Barbara, his wife, and his 1-year-old daughter, Jeanette, mother of 2 now, and who came all the way from Brooklyn to be here tonight. As I remember, Lennart was tall and thin but formidable. His hands were the size of a first baseman's glove. His eyes were Coke bottle thick, and he had a habit of scrunching his nose, tilting his head back so that they would stay on the bridge of his nose. He spoke with a nasal drawl that to my ear had no hint of Michigan upbringing. His intonation was very New York, even correcting my Yiddish. "It's not kvetch, it's kvetch." On the first day of classes, Lennart learned that I was Wayne's student, so he took up residence sitting behind me to see what Wayne had been teaching. He was not impressed. I had been using the palette Wayne assigned for my first year studying with him, which had phthalo, blue, green, and rose. The first thing he asked me was, "Why are you using those poisons to paint with?" I had no idea how toxic those paints were, and I just thought he meant that they were very overpowering. So I gave the standard student answer, 'Cause it's what Wayne had me use." He sighed, "Well, get rid of them. They're awful, and get into everything." And that was my introduction to Lennart. He sat behind me all summer, and every time I painted something that even mimicked Wayne's style, Lennart would take a deep breath and exhale and come and paint on my picture and say things like, "Look at that shape. Squint at it. See how the light gathers and pinches up at the wrist? It's not a highlight. It's just barely different than the shadow side. Make it the same, then make it different. by bringing a fresh note across the top. A highlight's not that high of a light. By the last few weeks of the program, all he had to do was breathe heavily from his nose, and I would know to change whatever I had been doing before he got up. It was quite a game. I would make simple tones. I was actually seeing more purple or blue, and I would hear the dreaded exhale. Let me get some water. I would instantly smear rag or scumble right through it with raw umber or gray and literally tone it down. Then he would reiterate, color sings in the tonal relationships, and color is in the middle values, not these Easter eggs you're painting. When I finally started to address some of the things Lennart had been teaching all summer, the program was ending, but I had what I thought was a pretty good little painting of the figure model sitting in a space filled with soft Italian light. I was happy with it. Then, with only an hour left of the final pose of the summer, Lennart said, "What's wrong with her neck?" It was stiff and a bit awkward, and the sitter's head did not sit on it correctly. I responded, "I won't have time to fix that. I'm trying to get these feet on the floor. Do you really think it needs fixing?" And he said, "Well, I wouldn't leave it like that." But I did. When summer ended, I returned to UC Davis. I mean, you can see like how stiff the neck is. She had a really long neck. And I squashed her head on it. When summer ended, I returned to UC Davis for my senior year. It was a confusing time for me after working with Lennart. It was hard to reconcile searching for clever conceptual motivations for making painting rather than making an actual good painting. I was confused what a good painting was or if they even existed. When I found myself confused like this, I would call Lennart. Hearing his unedited opinion put my mind at ease. It was always refreshing, but didn't always clear things up. For example, in one conversation, I asked, "Why does everyone talk about Piero della Francesca? You and Wayne bring him up a lot." And I just read he was Philip Guston's favorite painter. What made him so special when there were so many great Renaissance painters? It was so simple and far removed from the intellectual jujitsu I heard discussed when I sat in on graduate school studio critiques at UC Davis. Nothing anyone ever said about their art seemed to have any relation to the thing itself. And as a comic exercise, I tried to imagine Piero della Francesca trying to defend his paintings in a contemporary MFA setting. When I decided to go to grad school, I knew that I wanted more of what Lennart had to say and less intellectual sleight of hand that I saw at UC Davis. So I asked Lennart if I should apply to CUNY Brooklyn, where he had been teaching for years. And in typical Lennart fashion, he said, "Oh, you probably heard everything I have to say about painting." So I went to New York to study with him. And over the years in New York, I confirmed that I had not heard everything he had to say about painting. I was not the best student. I wish I could go back to grad school all over again. Well, I wish I could go study with Lennart again, not go to Brooklyn College. It was a department in disarray. The administrators loved that Lennart brought students in, well, at least their money, but not what he was necessarily teaching. I learned from Lennart that the chair and the history faculty were hoping he would retire when he was diagnosed with his illness, as they wanted to move in a more conceptual direction, the same way UC Davis had, in hopes they might become more contemporarily relevant, which to them meant non-representational painting, despite the fact that Lennart was the main reason for most MFA students going to Brooklyn College in the first place. At that time, I was surprised and disheartened to learn of the politics of academia, especially as it concerned Lennart. But now, after 22 years of being in academia, adjuncting and getting the occasional yearly contract and sitting in on faculty meetings, the one thing I've learned is that academia lacks any vision because they have big text Avery cartoon dollar signs covering their eyes. Indeed, after Lennart retired and I was still looking for a full-time teaching job, not getting any, he sighed his sigh and said, "Well, if it makes you feel any better, I probably wouldn't get hired nowadays either. Who knows what they want? They certainly don't." And this reminds me of a story my dear friend Von Sumner told me, who's here tonight with us. When he was talking to Wayne Thiebaud about Lennart, Von was also a student of Wayne's. And I can hear Wayne saying what he said. "I think he was the real art world. The rest of it is, I don't know what it is." Which speaks to the heart of Lennart's description of his own goals as a painter, what he called humble pie versus pie in the sky. In other words, the essential aspects of making a painting. So let's look at what forces, tensions, and influences that shaped his humble pie. I think we'll find they were not all that humble. That is, of course, unless you think the ancient Greeks, Titian, Poussin, Chardin, Degas, and Cezanne were somehow not pie in the sky. I should say, trying to write about Lennart might be one of the hardest things I've ever done. The quandary I faced was this: how can one begin to write about someone so taciturn and humble, but also so proud and uncompromising? Unlike our current era, where it's easy for egomaniacs to proclaim their own genius because we have no regard for history, but Lennart comes from a different time, one where humility mattered, one where history mattered, and where the latter begets the former. Indeed, Lennart was very aware of what came before him. I believe that's what made him reticent to make any declarative statements of any kind. For example, when speaking of an artist he admired, from Raphael to Cezanne, he would often temper his zeal by pointing out what he considered to be some shortcoming of the artist. It wasn't to tear them down. I think it allowed him a space to evolve his critical criteria, his taste, and his own intentions. Or it could just be that he was a Midwestern Swede where things are never great, they're just not bad. In writing this, I had to become a kind of detective to fill in the blanks from his autobiographical text in The Art of the Real, the catalog for this retrospective, as well as our conversations through the years. I had to plug in his relationship with the era and place in which he was immersed and developed as a painter. That's cute, isn't it? But I'm a bit weary of making declarative statements about him, not just because it wasn't in his nature, but because he'd be quick to point out how off the mark they were. "Oh, is that what you think I did?" I can hear him say it. He was reluctant to get too heady, not because he was some sort of anti-intellectual. In fact, quite the opposite. He was quite knowledgeable of contemporary theory. And I remember when I was in grad school in his figure painting class and reading a Benjamin Buchloh essay during one of our long breaks. "Oh, you're reading Buchloh. That's deep stuff. I remember reading that. That was a big deal when that came out." Then he walked away, and he might as well have said, "Cute, good luck with that. Won't help your painting any." It reminds me of a story about a Zen master shaking his head as the novice who preoccupies himself with sutras. But enlightenment can be a long road, and thankfully I had Lennart help cut through the bramble. For example, he had no patience for unnecessary distinctions when it came to painting. Again, I was in graduate school and just arrived in New York, and I was excited as a puppy. So I asked him, "What gallery should I go see to see good realist painting?" I mean, after all, he was a representational painter. I wanted to be a representational painter. But he just sighed. His mouth slack, almost nauseated, and said nothing. And I said, "Wait, what? What did I say?" And he said, "Oh, realism, who cares? Don't you want to just see good painting? That's all that matters." And it was a complete revelation to me. Which brings me then to attempting to contextualize his work by not talking about Lennart at all, which I guess I haven't been too much, just these little anecdotes that I have. So let's begin by going back to the beginning of civilization. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Okay, maybe not so far back, but at least to a crucial place in history, especially for art. Before the modern era, usually designated in the mid-19th century with the Industrial Revolution, the arts were economically tethered to church, monarchies, and the state. There you go. Those three things before the secular age, before the secular era, were as those institutions waned in economic power, artists had to become economically independent agents of their own invention. The modernist revolution gave rise to new economies born from new inventions that changed our very subjectivity. The things we may take for granted today were once radical ruptures to our 19th century counterparts. Train travel, newspapers, modes of information, modes of transportation, mass production, the invention of the sewing machine, companies that made clothes. People made them by hand. People preoccupied themselves with these activities, making food, making clothes. That all changed. The beginning of, that all blah, blah, that transformed their conception of time and space, right? You have more time, you have also time and space, the train, which came to characterize the aims and goals of modern art and the avant-garde itself. In the 20th century, between the First and Second World Wars, modern art was imported to America by European artists fleeing war-ravaged countries, and the rise of Nazism spreading throughout Europe. Let's just say Hitler wasn't a fan of modern art. But by the end of the Second World War, the United States found itself the industrial and cultural center of the world. It was during this time artist emigres such as Arshel Gorky, Piet Mondrian, Joseph Albers, and Hans Hofmann had a powerful influence on young artists living in New York, who would become known as the New York School, or more commonly referred to as the abstract expressionists. For brevity's sake, let's just say the goals of the abstract expressionists can be seen as Platonic idealism filtered through the lens of Jungian archetypes, concerning themselves with forms culled from the subconscious, manifested in shape and color, that privileged the materiality of paint, the gestural mark, and the flatness of the picture plane, where all was in flux, and where any objective reference was only an armature to be obfuscated if there was a reference at all. Well, there we go. By this time, in the early 1950s, there seems to be two important moments that shaped Lennart's thinking about his subject matter and his handling of the material of paint. The first was seeing the auction catalog of Degas' studio contents and seeing in Degas' paintings the same kind of austerity and detachment he saw in Velázquez. So he set about to make a painting that captured this detachment with an emotionally charged subject. Falling Man was his attempt to do so by wanting to paint a figure up in the air that he gleaned from Tintoretto's Miracle of St. Mark. Falling Man. I think he captured the dichotomy well. The falling figure descends from the unknown, trapped in time, his fate certain. Nevertheless, he will never hit the ground. It seems more an angelic ascension than tragedy. As his arms seem to flap like an angel's wings, while oblivious passersby wobble at the picture's edge. Everything solid, melting into air. The second seminal moment is connected to the first, and it came when Lennart read De Kooning Paints a Picture, a 1953 article in Art News written by Thomas Hess. In it, De Kooning describes his ambivalence and uncertainty about his paintings, making constant changes, saying, I can't make any progress until I don't know anything. Something like that. For Lennart, this sentiment tied the abstract expressionist directly to Degas, someone who constantly changed his pictures and whose dissatisfaction seemed to prevent him from ever finishing them. These similar temperaments, separated by 80 years, opened a bridge for Lennart, a way to connect the past to the present and a way to engage with the abstract expressionists without being abstract. This way of thinking about painting as a process, as something evolving, changing, and shifting, appealed to something in Lennart's nature. The thing that made him want to paint, which was the very act of painting. In this way, painting is alive, a parry and thrust of curiosity and proposition that opens endless possibilities, which he would admit was not always a great thing, but for Lennart, it seemed better than charging towards a predetermined finish line. In other words, it was the search, not the destination. So Hess's article on de Kooning sealed Lennart's determination to live in New York, as he didn't see much of a future in Detroit or connections to like-minded individuals. Once in New York, he reconnected with his friend Pat Posloff, whom he knew from Cranbrook Academy of Art in Michigan, and who hosted gatherings of abstract expressionists to discuss concepts of modern art. There, Lennart immersed himself in critical dialogue of the New York artists. The history is a bit foggy, but the so-called art club seemed to have a few locations throughout those years: 6th Street, 8th Street, 10th Street, Broadway, 125th Street. Kidding, not that far, but I could not pin down any exact where it was. So I'll just say it was Broadway, because that's where Lennart said it was. He got an apartment where he could paint and a job at Robert Kulick's studio frame shop. Kulick had been a painter, and as the story goes, he had quit painting for 10 years until he was called upon to frame some 300 Giorgio Morandi paintings in 1957. But I'm left wondering if it wasn't a young Lennart Anderson who began working for Kulick in '53 that might have already piqued Kulick's interest in small, intimate still life painting. Perhaps a question for a different time, unless anyone here knows. Okay. At the time, Lennart began attending classes at the Art Students League with Edwin Dickinson, and although Lennart didn't study with him long, I think it's fair to say he had a lasting impact on Lennart. Born in 1981, Dickinson was an artist of an older generation of American artists that the younger painters still embraced, given their penchant for European transplants like Hoffman. So let's briefly look at some of Dickinson's painting and see how his pictorial concerns foreshadow much of the New York school. Dickinson, like Lennart, is a difficult artist to categorize. There is no ism he can fit neatly into. He worked without a fixed style from genre to genre, handling the landscape very differently from a studio painting. When dealing with a landscape or portrait, his goal was to quickly capture in one sitting an ephemeral, fleeting feeling of light and place in generalized, open, edgeless forms, as if at a glance, what is seen is already melting. He referred to this as premier coup. Yeah, check that out. Or first attempt or cut. But his studio pictures utilize more closed forms and harder edges, seem to be culled less from comforting dreams than a nightmare. I don't know if you guys can see that. These paintings combine odd tensions, acrid and ethereal colors, and stark contrasts of dark and light. They combine contradictions of sculptural palpability and vaporous volatility, all condensed into a dizzying composition lacking a unified focal point in a kind of centrifugal dispersal out to the edges. In other words, what Dickinson was doing from the teens through the 30s was right in line with those New York painters of the latter era of the 40s and 50s. Most of Dickinson's American contemporaries in the 20s and 30s were averse to European modernism. For example, American scene painters like Thomas Hart Benton, whose motifs were much more bucolic and lyrical. Or someone like Paul Cadmus, whose motifs were, let's just say, alcoholic and metropolitan. You get the euphemism? Compared to Dickinson's, with the scene painters, as mannered as they were, with boneless bodies made of elastic, space-conformed to legible notions of foreground, middle ground, and background. With Dickinson, we get an odd, almost Japanese woodblock type of compression of space, where the picture seems to be tilting up to the picture plane. The same could be said of the goals of New York School. The critics like Clement Greenberg, who extolled these concepts 20 or 30 years after Dickinson. But I think it might be helpful to look at some of those New York School artists and compare them to Dickinson and consider each of the dates of their making. So Dickinson's landscape over there, so simple and minimal. This is Milton Resnick's Sweet Potato. Simple lines, aggressive. It could almost be a landscape, all right? Or Dickinson's landscape that almost seems like it came right out of de Kooning's studio. Quick, erratic, aggressive. All right. No, or very minimal, like Franz Klein. That simple form in the middle. Interesting, subtle, simple pictures. Of course, I'm not saying he was the origin of abstract expressionism, just that many young artists were taking classes at the Art Students League in the 40s and 50s, encountering his teaching, including Elaine de Kooning, who remained friends with Edwin until his death. Nor am I saying he was Lennart's only influence, just that there was an affinity of temperaments and aspiration. What I am saying is that New York in the 1950s was a small art world with probably as many artists in the whole city as there are enrolled in one large art school today. And those people were talking to each other, not like today's students who watch reels and don't do any work, but still want a major retrospective at the Whitney for their anime drawings. Sorry, I still have a little PTSD. Okay, I digress. But given Dickinson's relationship to many of those young artists in New York, I don't think it's a stretch to see the influence he had on some of those New York painters, concerned as they were with an all-over the canvas type composition. The point is, all art is interconnected. Artists look, discern, create personal hierarchies and heroes with whom they create a dialogue or dialectic across 30 or 300 years. Like love letters across time, it's a beautiful ongoing process, one without origin. I think sometimes to our detriment, we carry the early 20th century myth of rugged individualist and the lone genius who springs forth fully formed like Athena from the head of Zeus. It's not the case. So when we look at Lennart's work from the 1950s, I think it's apparent he's processing a lot of the formal and theoretical ideas he was encountering in New York, but never abandoned his heroes, Poussin, Ingres, Degas, and Cézanne, or the figure within a discernible context, which can mean a lot of things. But compared to, say, someone like Willem de Kooning, who eviscerates the body in his formal process, extracting it from time and space, both internalizing it, right, psychologically, and eternalizing it in a way more similar to a Byzantine icon, which is supposed to have that idea. No place, no time, forever, eternity. In Lennart's first Bacchanal, shown here, his nod to Titian's Andrians, but also Cezanne, we can see him generalizing or codifying the figures in simple gestural strokes that echo the ecstatic energy of his subject. But it's clear even then that he was after a kind of elegance. I don't have a pointer. I just love this figure here. It captures everything about the elegance of that dance move. It's clear even then he was after a kind of elegance of shape and delineation of line that would guide him for the rest of his life, even turning the strong triangular shape of Titian's recumbent nude, and I probably should have had that up there, into a toy sailboat, if you don't know Titian's, Andrian's, Bacchanal. Okay, well, for another time. He stole that. He just put a little triangle down there, strong shape. And in this early street scene, we can see him taking on Poussin's processional multi-figure compositions, infusing it with a variety of mark making, both tentative and aggressive, quick and deliberate, all reflecting the agitation and gesture of the scene before us, where the picture plane is shattered into an almost kaleidoscopic interconnections of tone, color, and shape. In 1958, he was awarded the Prix de Rome, a 3-year residency in the ancient city, and there his work changed a bit, most notably in temperature, moving towards warmer tones, but also he begins to close his forms a bit more in distinct and elegant shapes that use very much like Piero della Francesca, a dense, intentional groupings and overlaps that can feel like one figure in sequential motion. Can we see that? It's always an interesting thing. Look at those points of contiguity. Nose going right up to the ear, right? Or that eye and that nose. Little eye peeking out. All these kind of little tangents that are just so remarkable. He's a wonderful painter. All right, we can go back. There we go. Did I say this already? Very much like Piero della Francesca, dense, intentional groupings and overlaps that can feel like one figure in sequential motion. I mean that, look at that, it's very much like Piero, those heads gathering, or the women over there. You can't really tell whose head is whose. Here, heads and bodies blend into one another and emerge out of one another in odd points of contiguity and tangents, where one has to look very closely to figure out, yeah, we got that. The picture opens up in the middle, and the groupings seem to be in opposition, very much like Degas' Young Spartans. There's a tension between each of them. And it opens up. This, of course, is fairly obvious, a kind of tension between kids. Sexual tension, aggressive tension, desire, aloofness, atavistic, animal qualities. All right, I'll just go on so that we'll move on. Let's move back. And the center of the picture opens up to one figure racing towards the picture plane, creating finally an in and out from the back and forth, that tension that's coming out at us. But when Lennart returned to America in 1961, he set out to make paintings inspired by the Roman frescoes he had seen in Pompeii. Here he gives up the high drama of his street scenes for an intimate interior space where soft ambient light bathes the room. His goal was to infuse the nude with dignity, strength, self-possession, and agency, in order to elevate the nude as a noble subject that reflects the heroic ideals of the Greco-Roman tradition from which it originated. This kind of psychological interiority was with Lennart from the beginning, most particularly in his portraits, but it shows up in a more pronounced manner in his group figure compositions. So even when he returns to a motif on the street, the dramas are not dramatized. They are existential spaces of the mind, of desire, of isolation and play. Let's look for a second, try to feel the tensions in this picture. It's a little dark. This is why I need this tension here. Go ahead. There's that strict divide. The reciprocal gaze says so much. While this boy, part street tough, as Lennart would call them, street tough. I hadn't heard that since I watched the Bowery Boys on television when I was a kid. And part Piero angel, lost in his own thoughts, perhaps distracted by what he sees across the street. Then there's the man teasing the dog with a treat, captured in midair forever, wanting, never getting, which very much echoes the subtle interplay between these two figures, a kind of unrequited love. Now you can see it a little better. That tension, that gaze is so deeply psychological, filled with desire, filled with longing, filled with never fulfilling. Right? Just like, I don't know if that's Lennart himself modeling for that. That dog just hanging in air, forever teased. When Lennart returns to the Bacchanal as a subject almost 20 years after his first, shown earlier, his 1970s idol, Iddles, right? I got that right. That's how he corrected me. I was like, I love those idols, man. It's like, they're Iddles. His 1970 Iddles replaced conflict with the joy of human spirit, a motif about which his heroes Titian and Ang made paintings, saying, if it was good enough for them, it should be good enough for me. He painted them in acrylic, or plastic as he called it, which he seemed to always be fighting from building up as he layered the fresh notes on the top, as I said earlier. I loved seeing that thick paint. I loved seeing it build up. It had such a suchness to it. It reminded me of Chardin's whites, and if you've ever seen Chardin's whites, they're luscious. You just want to, they're like ice cream. But when I told him, he was irritated, and he said, oh, I don't want it to build up. And I remember him painting. I was in grad school. I would come over to the house, and he would be like, I don't want it to build up. And I guess he didn't want it to build up because he didn't want it to look labored. He wanted it to look fresh, just like something he would say in his classes. You should be able to get it in a few notes. Paint it simply. But I learned that painting simply is very difficult. So I liked that he built it up, even more after that. Because if he's struggling, then wow, that's pretty good. It's humbling to me. Because it showed that even for him, painting was difficult, right? But I think the pastoral landscape allowed him a space or a backdrop for the figure in movement. Originally a celebration of the wine god Bacchus, the initiates dance in ecstatic transcendence, a return to the golden age, a time before ego, and a time before shame. In those Elysian fields, a place death cannot touch. But death does touch. Sorry. In this painting, Crying Satyr, that Lennart painted after his wife Barbara passed, painting from a drawing of Barbara, both lament and celebration. It's one of his last idyllic landscapes, isn't it? close to it. Yeah. Now, because of time, I've focused on the trajectory of some of the aspects of his figure painting as the general theme, because I think it most conspicuously exemplifies the expanse of his interests, his experimentation, and his wish to get everything he loved into one painting. But not discussing his still life and portraits is obviously a gaping hole in any talk about him, as they were arguably his most important work. I faced the dilemma that one could make a whole lecture on his portraits and heads, as he was one of the greatest portrait painters of the 20th century, if not, at least, in the conversation with the greatest who ever did them: Velázquez, Holbein, Sargent. He named his dog after Sargent. Or the little-known Battista Moroni. Oh, do you like Moroni? I was like, wow. I had just seen him at the Norton Simon. That was one of my favorite heads. This one. Oh, okay. As for still life, I regret not talking about his love for Chardin and Morandi, who were instrumental in how he thought about how paintings work, tensions, gatherings, groupings, formal arrangements of shape and color, truncations, impossible overlaps. Look at that Morandi. Everything is melting into one another. Can you tell what's coming forward and what's going back? Makes almost no sense. Okay. But I will give you one short example. He was working on a still life when I lived across the street from him in Brooklyn, and I would visit almost weekly to see what he was working on, and I remember there was one still life he painted on for weeks. Not that one. Just moving a single apricot or peach stone or pit around the picture, painting it in here, painting it out, painting it back in, moving it around again and again, trying to find out the right place or the wrong place, or at least an unpredictable place for it in relation to the rest of the motif, reminding me of a stargazer trying to decide on his favorite star. And I didn't mention his battle with cancer or macular degeneration, because all those things obviously must have weighed heavily on him. He never stopped painting. Even as his eyes went, he persevered. Although I attempted to trace all art history through some of his pictures, it's just a fragment. Perhaps why Lennart was so reticent. Once you open your mouth, like I did, you're opening a Pandora's jar, and I can hear him now. Oh, I didn't do any of that. But since I'm not taciturn, I will say just one more thing. After all of this, I admit, I can't tell you what to see in his pictures or how to see them. But when you look at Lennart's work, he holds the world in his hands and shows you how it feels. How it is and how maybe it should be. It's a place full of endless wonder and beauty, exquisite grace, pathos, and joy. If he was uncompromising, it was because he was uncompromising about the beauty he aspired to. It was tenderness that drove him, physical and emotional empathy. And if you spend time with his work, look long and carefully. I know you'll see the strength of his spirit. Thank you. I'm sure I said everything. I left no stone unturned, didn't I? Wow. All right, well, that's good for me. Really? Everyone's going to hit me up just like students, right? Because they're all going to be like, hey, what about, can I turn in my assignment later? Hey, get an extra day?
There's no pop quiz.
Oh, no. you didn't bring out the test for everybody. Really? No questions? Did I really? Yeah.
So, you worked in oils and acrylic?
Mostly oils. I think I don't know what made him decide to paint in plastic, as he said. I think it was just a kind of layering. I thought that's the hardest thing to do when I asked him about it, because it dies as it dries. It doesn't stay so vibrant. But those things are like light bulbs. They're amazing. Yeah.
I just have a comment. I just want to thank you for pointing out all the influences that he had so beautifully. To see the Velasquez and to see the different portraits and then to see them show up in his paintings.
He had such a love for painting. And if you visited him in his studios, he'd have his book, and he'd have Velasquez, he'd have Cezanne, he had Baltus, Raphael towards the end. I remember, and I really, damn technology. I have recorded a whole, like a 2-hour I visit. And we talked about Cezanne and Lois Dodd and painting like that. And I updated my phone. And it was the greatest because it was about Cezanne. And then the next time I went, he was all jazzed about Raphael. It was very different, in terms of how the paint application. But I mean, he was such a wonderful art historian as well. And I don't mean it in the academic sense. I mean it in like a sports fan, like sports TV where people are arguing about who's the best or something. And there is no answer. Next week you'll be in love with, I don't know, Degas again. I think he did say that. I remember I was getting really into Degas. And he said, "Oh, you like Degas?" He's like, "Well, the Degas I like more and more, I guess." And it was just this kind of like, what? It's Degas, man. But it was that kind of thing, like the ones that he didn't want, but the ones like Titian. We had a conversation about Veronese versus Titian. He's like, "Well, I guess Veronese is more consistent, but the greatest Titians are probably the greatest paintings that ever existed." So there was always this kind of hierarchy and nerdy kind of just love of the history of art with him. Tender heart, yeah.
Were either of his parents artists or artistic?
I don't know. His dad was a pattern maker for Ford Motor Company, and his mom was a housewife back then, trad mom. But yeah, sir.
What would you say is the status of representational art in art schools these days?
I don't know. I mean, there's places you can go, and then they're going to teach you, and you're going to have wonderful paintings, right? And you're going to learn a lot. But I remember Lennart saying something about one of those schools, and since I'm being recorded, I'm not going to say the name of that school. But he said, "Oh, that gravy painting school." Meaning there was just so much brown in it. And, because it looks classical, I guess. So I think there's wonderful places to learn how to draw the figure. But look, Chardin taught himself. So I think it depends on the student. And I think that there's some of that, it's like Lennart said to me. I said something so wrong. It was like, a career or something. I don't even know what I was saying. It was probably me like, I want to have a career and be on the cover of Art Forum or something, I said, "What do you want a career for? paint because you want a career. You paint because you love to paint. You're going to do it anyway. I don't know. I think I agree with him. He taught me so much that it's not really about figurative or non-figurative. Don't you want to just see good painting? And I think that that's the thing that we kind of need. That's why I gave this lecture, is to open up the context and not disparage one thing over the other, but to allow us an avenue in to every kind of painting. Make no separation. I don't know if that answered your question. Anything else?
What would you say is the biggest lesson you learned from Lennart?
I don't know. I couldn't even, I could have had 4 more hours of this lecture. I felt like I felt bad for you guys. You know? It was like, I don't know. I think that the things that I really, that I highlighted, like when he said that, it was such a revelation, about like, oh, realism, who cares? I mean, I can still hear it to this day. It blew my mind. And it made me think differently. And I did have some context because of Wayne Thiebaud. He was a wonderful teacher and loved all of the same people and knew all the same people. He was about 8 years older than Lennart. Was friends with Franz Klein and de Kooning. So although Wayne is a kind of representational painter, I visited his studio, Wayne's studio, and he had little attempts at trying to do de Kooning, and so he loved painting, and I think that's all. That's the greatest lesson. Does that make sense? Oh, I thought you had a question. Really? My best friend doesn't have a question for me?
He's saving it for later.
No.
I've been asking you for 20 years.
No one else? All right. Yeah, sure.
A lot of this work is from institutional collections and private collections. I'm assuming you hadn't seen a lot of it in person before.
Yeah. No.
I'm wondering which piece that you hadn't seen until you put the show together in person.
Barbara.
Barbara?
The big Barbara.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've been waiting 30 years to see that picture. Yeah. It's amazing. Yeah. All of it's amazing. And I wish I had seen it when I was in grad school, because it would have cleared up a lot of things, Like, I can get away with that, It was pretty thin. Why is he saying, like, my paintings are thin? I could have said, like, well, I could have been Lennart right now. Well, your painting's thin.
If you could steal one,
Yeah.
if Jess let you in the middle of the night
I'm not going to.
and you were dressed as the Hamburglar and no cameras were on, which one would you take?
I couldn't make up my mind. I'd be the Hamburglar sitting in the middle, just going like, I don't know. I'll just be there in the morning. They'll be opening the gallery. Popcorn. I wouldn't want, and I wouldn't. Here's the thing. I sat for him before I left New York. He used to have a habit of drawing or painting people, students, friends who were going to leave New York. And he couldn't get my head. I had a shaved head at the time. And he was like, oh, what? You shaved your head? Why? I don't know, man. It was easier. So I'm sitting there, and he hated it. So that's when I told him that I actually did steal one of his paintings. Yeah. When I was in Italy, I thought they had left. I thought the whole family had left. So I have a painting. I was like, wait, what? He's gone. he's not coming back. So I took a head of Shifra. And so I told him, I was like, I said, I took, I gotta tell you, I took that head, He's like, I wondered what happened to that. Because he was gonna give me a drawing. And I said, I have a head of yours, will you sign it? And he said yes, and then I never had him sign it. So I have a painting I already stole from him, if that answers the question.
He had a great impact on you.
Yeah.
How have you taken those lessons and put them into your own teaching?
I put them into my teaching, and that's what got me fired. Seriously, like being uncompromising, having expectations for students, knowing that students can do it, and that's the thing. I don't have any, that's why, I grew up a hippie, that kind of thing. But I've seen too many students who had no art background, especially here for the first 5 years. For the first 5 years here, I had nursing students who could have blown away anyone from Art Center because they just worked at it. Through critique and dialogue, the things that we're not allowed to say. You can't even say critique nowadays, it's discussion. But we need guidelines, we need to learn how to do something. And so there's strategies and ways of thinking about it, ways of executing it. And I think that that's the lesson. That's why I had that first painting up of kids in elementary school. We're taking this thing very seriously and not just as an arts and crafts kind of activity, but something that you can learn from. The sensitivity of your own hand, physical empathy, all of the things that are demanded even of somebody like de Kooning. You might see that coarse, kind of rugged painting, musculature of painting. But it's all the sensitivity of any exquisite drawing of Ang. It's the same thing, and I think that we can learn that. We just don't continue to do it, or we don't, like I said, we don't learn to do one thing well. We just jump over here and we have an assignment like this, and we have an assignment like that, and I'm taking an art class. And it sounds horrible because that's just not in our culture anymore, is to work hard, especially with something like art, because we think of it as extra. But if you really consider we are products of art, maybe not capital A art, but we are products of making signs from the beginning of time, drawing on caves, spiritual investment, moving meditation, whatever it is. I think that we come from that. That's how we told our stories. It's how we told who we are. It's the sign systems that binded us, right? We're a cougar clan, whatever it is, right? We dress up in cougar skin. We draw cougars. We take on their power, right? When I'm drawing a cougar, I'm taking on the power of the cougar. So I think it's been with us long before civilization, right? Long before history. I don't know if I answered your question at all, but I do think that we are missing something very valuable in arts education, something about civics. I think that art is a civics lesson, not just some activity, right? Did that? All right. All right, thank you, everybody. I love you, goodbye.